Russ Diamond is a Republican candidate for lieutenant governor. Why are you running for this office?
Well, I think that as I've looked at how we are going to beat Josh Shapiro in the fall, we need a lieutenant governor candidate who, number one, can help our next governor beat Josh Shapiro in the election. After the election, we need somebody who can help our next governor hit the ground running and form a partnership with the legislature in Harrisburg. And then, of course, the only reason that we have a lieutenant governor, you need somebody with a vast life experience to provide a steady hand in case some tragedy, God forbid, happens to the governor and you're asked to step into the governorship. And I believe I'm uniquely qualified in all three of those areas to help our party beat Josh Shapiro.
Can you talk a little bit more about your background? You're a small business owner?
That's correct. Before I was elected to the legislature in 2014, I ran an audio-video production business. We're currently celebrating our 30th year in business. Before that, I was a factory worker. I worked 12-hour shifts overnight, for 7 years. I've been a truck driver. I've been a working musician. I'm an author. I'm a pilot. I bring that vast, wide range of life experience that I think is going to help if in case something happens to the governor and I am asked to step into the governorship.
You're currently serving your fourth term as a state representative. Can you talk a minute about your accomplishments, and have you had any bills signed into law?
Sure. One of my big accomplishments was bringing industrial hemp back to Pennsylvania. It was illegal in Pennsylvania to grow hemp for a very, very long time, nearly 80 years. But in my second term in office, I got an industrial hemp research bill passed, and now currently that industry is growing, and eventually that's going to turn into $1 billion business. It's going to be good for consumers. It's going to be good for farmers. It's going to be good for the environment. It's going to be good for manufacturing. And it potentially could make Pennsylvania not just a leader in what resources we have under the ground, but on top of the ground as well.
One of your main duties as lieutenant governor is overseeing the Senate. What will your duties be as president of the Senate?
As president of the Senate, your job is really to run the meeting, not to participate in the process, but to run the meeting. And as I've watched somebody I admire a lot, Speaker of the House Brian Cutler, who is a close friend of mine, he runs a good meeting. And unfortunately, we've seen with the current lieutenant governor, we've seen times in the Senate when things have gotten out of hand. And that's because the lieutenant governor himself is sort of a partisan. I believe when you're running a meeting, you can't take sides of either of the two parties that are on the floor, battling it out, however they do that, over legislative business. You have to simply run the meeting. Now, occasionally, lieutenant governor can cast a vote on procedural matters to break ties, but the lieutenant governor can't cast a tie-breaking vote on a final legislative decision. So simply you're running the meeting, and I believe you need to do that with dignity and with honor.
How would you maintain decorum if things got out of control?
Well, I think you gavel down people. You call on the sergeant of arms if you have to do that, to clear the aisles, to bring people back in order. And again, you have to be kind of a nonpartisan while you're doing that.
If the Senate has a current Republican majority, it may have it next year as well. If a Democratic senator rose to make a motion that was valid, would you recognize them first, or would you recognize a Republican colleague first?
Well, you have to follow the rules of procedure in the Senate. And that's one of the problems that we have with the current lieutenant governor, is that he did not always follow the rules of procedure in the Senate. Those rules are time-tested, and they're honored, and they should be honored in order to make debate fair to everyone.
You'll be working with a parliamentarian. How familiar are you with the parliamentary process?
Well, I will just call back to my history. Before I was elected to the House of Representatives, I was kind of an expert in Robert's Rules of Order, with our county committee, our county Republican committee in Lebanon County. And I served on the bylaws committee there when I took those things into consideration when we rewrote parts of our bylaws. So parliamentary procedure is very, very important. And you need people who understand parliamentary procedure to actually run the meeting. That said, nobody's an expert like a parliamentarian is. So the choice of parliamentarian, when you were the president of the Senate, is also very, very important as well.
Lieutenant Governor also chairs the Board of Pardons. What's the role of the Board of Pardons, and how often do they meet?
Well, the Board of Pardons meets regularly to review, cases regarding clemency and commutation and pardons. And here's the thing, is that role, you need to be a fair person there too. And I don't believe you can go into that role with any agenda like our current lieutenant governor has. I believe you need to go and you need to judge everything on a case-by-case basis. For me, the best way to judge somebody's perspective and their potential in life, whether they're going to qualify for pardon or that sort of thing, is to try to get to know them personally. Just like you and I are sitting here having a conversation across the table. Now, I know that's not always possible with somebody who's incarcerated, that sort of thing, but you have to try to get to know people. I mean, it's the same thing in life when you're doing business or when you're in politics. If you don't actually know the other person you're dealing with, you can't really make a decision. So as I would see my role there, it would be trying to get to know that person who is coming before the board as best as possible in order to make a wise decision that's independent of any agenda that anybody else might have.
Under what circumstances would you vote to pardon a convicted felon?
Well, again, I mean, you can't make that decision beforehand. You can't say, this is my agenda going in. You have to judge each case on a case-by-case basis, based on the facts put in front of you. You can't go in with any certain predetermined agenda about how you're going to blanket treat anyone who comes before the board.
In some jurisdictions, nonviolent marijuana offenses have been decriminalized for small amounts. Would you vote to pardon a person who has been incarcerated for selling marijuana?
Again, I agree, you know, we have that going on in some places in Pennsylvania. But again, that also is going to be determined by, you know, how has this person acted while they've been incarcerated? Have they been a model prisoner? Have they you know, rehabilitated themselves over anything else? And you do have to judge everything on a case-by-case basis.
A pardon is different than commutation or clemency. What rights do you get back when you get pardoned?
Well, when you get pardoned, you essentially become a free citizen again, and you know you may not have those things that hang over you when you're a convicted felon, such as a prohibition on your right to bear arms. So you know every one of these three areas are different.
You also have the right to vote, the right to run for office again.
You have the right to seek office, but convicted felons still can vote in Pennsylvania. In fact, part of the release package when they put people out after when they're on parole from a felony is the voter registration. We don't prohibit convicted felons from registering to vote after they've done their time.
Should we prohibit them from voting?
No, we don't. No. Look, when somebody is released from prison, that's an indication that they have served their time. Okay, or at least have served enough of their time that they can go out on some kind of supervised release. I believe the franchise of voting should be available to everyone, and we shouldn't prohibit someone from voting simply because they made a mistake some years ago that they are rehabilitating themselves from.
What would you do to change the current criminal justice system? There's been a lot of talk about that.
Yeah, well, there is a lot of movement going on in the criminal justice system regarding what you just talked about, which was the marijuana charges, when it's nonviolent charges, okay? We understand that, and I think we do have to examine that in Pennsylvania. I also think we have to take a hard look at the death penalty in Pennsylvania. It's been a very long time since Pennsylvania has executed anyone, although people are still getting sentenced to death. That really ties up the courts, and we should really have a sane conversation about whether having the death penalty in place in Pennsylvania, practically speaking, is useful anymore, because we spend an awful lot of taxpayer money convicting people and making sure those death penalties stick, yet we're not actually carrying out the sentence.
The current governor's not signing death warrants, for example.
And even when a governor has signed death warrants, we haven't had any executions. Tom Corbett did sign a number of death warrants, but we didn't execute anyone in Pennsylvania. And that's also, you know, it's tied up in the courts and that sort of thing. So as a practical matter, as a means of saving the taxpayer money, we might want to have a sane conversation about whether we want to actually continue to sentence people to death in Pennsylvania.
The Lieutenant Governor also chairs the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. What are PEMA's responsibilities?
Well, Pima steps in anytime there's a flood, there's any kind of disaster like that. I mean, they had a big role when we had 3 Mile Island here in Pennsylvania, and they had a role during COVID as well. Now, look, I had a lot of beefs with Governor Tom Wolf's handling of the COVID crisis, but as somebody who's going to be involved in something like that, I believe I can at least advise our new governor about the pitfalls we hit during COVID and how we might not want to hit those pitfalls again, depending on what the emergency is.
If you were Lieutenant Governor during the pandemic, what would you have recommended to the governor to limit the public's exposure to the virus?
Well, I think Tom Wolf's handling of the COVID crisis was horrific. He blanket used his emergency powers to shut down everyone in Pennsylvania, but he ignored one of the most powerful pieces of emergency powers that a governor has in Pennsylvania. He could have, at the very beginning, commandeered private property, with compensation, of course. He could have commandeered hospitals and entire hotels to create COVID recovery wards, called up the National Guard to help staff them, to provide safe haven for those seniors who were recovering from COVID, instead of sending them back into nursing homes like ticking time bombs to infect other people. He totally ignored that most powerful of emergency powers in Pennsylvania. So I would have advised the governor, don't close down businesses, and simply don't close down some businesses and leave others that are in the exact same kind of line of business open. The governor handled this disaster emergency powers really, really horribly. And that's why I suggested on day 11 of his disaster emergency that we terminate the disaster emergency, because I knew some things would become judgment calls. And frankly, that was the beginning of the process that led to us having constitutional amendments on the ballot that the people finally approved on May 18th, 2021. And we terminated. We were the only state in the entire nation that intervened and reduced a governor's emergency powers, and for good reason.
Would you have declared an emergency in the first place if you were governor?
I'm not sure I would have declared an emergency in the first place. However, when you talk about those seniors in the nursing homes, I think there was call for calling some sort of disaster emergency for that, but a very limited one. Look, the governor had 2 weeks' notice from the first outbreak in the United States in Washington, in Kirkland, Washington, where it just rampaged through a nursing home. He had 2 weeks' notice to do that. Yet he didn't pay attention to that to the effect that he should have, where he could have commandeered hospitals and hotels with compensation, of course, called up the National Guard and created those COVID recovery wards that would have saved so many seniors who were still back in the nursing home and weren't sick until patients came back and spread COVID around in there.
As Pima director, or as Pima president or chairman of the board, you'd also be working with the fire commissioner who reports to the lieutenant governor. What sort of conversations would you have about that issue? Well,
I think one of the biggest problems we have in Pennsylvania is with our volunteer fire services. In the 1990s, we had 300,000 volunteer firefighters in Pennsylvania, and now we have less than 30,000. We have to find ways in Pennsylvania to encourage people to volunteer to go out and fight fires in our communities once again. There's a lot of problems with that. A, funding. B, the amount of training that we now require first-time firefighters to go through. It costs almost over $900 to get a firefighter 1 rating. And some guy who's just, he works every day and he wants to volunteer and he wants to help his community, $900 is a big ticket.
It's like a week's salary.
Yeah, it really is. And that's one of the reasons that volunteerism is, volunteerism is down overall in the entire nation, which is a sad fact. But when it comes to our firefighters, those people who are putting their lives on the line while we're sleeping peacefully at night, we really ought to do things to make sure that they don't have to pay out of their pocket just to serve our communities.
On your website, there's a quote that says, "If there is no faith in the integrity of our elections, there will be no faith in those who are elected to govern." You were elected during the 2020 election. Do you have faith in the integrity of Pennsylvania's election system that elected you? And if not, why not?
Well, there's a difference between my race and the state house race. There's 203 state house seats in Pennsylvania. They were all up for election in 2020. My race was decided by 10,000 votes. I beat my opponent by 10,000 votes. There's not really any question of whether I won or not there, like there was on the statewide range. The presidency received 450,000 more votes than any other race, all the state house races combined. 450,000 votes.
Isn't it typical for the presidency to get more votes than any other office, though?
Absolutely it is. But when people say, well, you're challenging potentially, what happened in the statewide race, but you're not challenging your own race. Well, there's a significant difference there. When you divide the difference in the presidential vote, 80,000 votes, or roughly, by 203, you're looking at a 400 vote difference in any given statewide race. I won by 10,000 votes. So I'm not going to question the validity of my victory at all. But I will continue to question the validity of our statewide system. And look, here's the bottom line. After 2 years of dealing with this, and I've been at the forefront of dealing with this mess, I am firmly on the side of we need to go back to what a friend of mine calls vote Amish. All paper ballots, marked by hand, counted by humans, at the polling place on election night. Period. End of story.
Won't that lead to slower election counting results?
I don't believe so. We've done that before. We've counted ballots, paper ballots, absentee ballots at the polling place all up until Act 77 was passed. And there was no problem. We always had results on time. And if results on time is the issue, well, then our machines have not helped us at all. I mean, we've seen it's gone days and days and days. And even in May 2021, when it was an off year, quote, off year primary, it took us a couple days to figure out whether we had actually won those ballot questions. It's because these machines are actually slowing us down when the people who you trust and in your neighborhood, at your local polling place, they can count those votes, even if they're on paper, without machines, in a quicker fashion.
You voted for Act 77 in 2019, which created no excuse mail-in voting, which you're talking about. Do you regret doing so?
I absolutely regret doing so. And the reason I voted for it was because I actually read the Constitution when we were running that bill, and there is no provision of the Constitution which explicitly says that only in-person voting and the traditional absentee system are the only ways of voting in Pennsylvania. It's not explicitly in the Constitution. That was brought up by two Supreme Court precedents in 1862 and 1924, which, by the way, no one notified us of when we were running Act 77. Now, as a rank and file member of the General Assembly, I don't have any legal staff that works directly for me. I have to rely on other legal staff that work for other people. No one brought that to our attention. Now, had someone brought those two Supreme Court precedents to our attention, I certainly wouldn't have voted for Act 77. But here's what I have done since then. I've introduced House Bill 1717, which is a constitutional amendment, which would codify those two Supreme Court rulings and the current Commonwealth Court ruling into the Constitution so that when someone like me in the future actually reads the Constitution, we can see what the Supreme Court has decided before. They should have done that in 1862. They should have done that in 1924, but no one did. But I'm prepared to do it. And look, even if the Supreme Court overturns the Commonwealth Court ruling, my bill serves now as a rallying point for those of us who want to get rid of no excuse mail-in voting without having to go around a governor who might veto it.
If you had to step in and be governor, are you up to the task?
I believe I am up to the task, and that's what I talked about in the first part of our interview. My vast life experience would give me many, many wells to draw from when trying to make that transition smooth. I mean, if a tragedy would befall our governor, God forbid, it would be a shock to the Commonwealth, and you really need a steady hand to step into that spot in order to do that. We can look back to Mark Schweiker, who actually did that in Pennsylvania. And he was an honorable man, and he did a great job. And I was quite surprised that he never ran for governor after that, because he did such a great job making that transition and shepherding the state after our governor left.
You'll be working with the governor as lieutenant governor. What strengths will you bring to the table when you meet with the governor? Well,
the strengths I bring to the table, are my life experience. My experience in Harrisburg. This is very important to help the governor hit the ground running. We need a partnership between the executive branch and the legislative branch. I don't think a lot of people know this, but it's been almost a dozen years since a governor or a lieutenant governor has been inside the House Republican caucus room to actually talk about policies and priorities. Governor Tom Corbett went in initially after he was inaugurated. He said hello, that sort of thing, but he never went back. I think we need a governor who is connected to the legislature so that those two branches can work together in tandem to turn Pennsylvania around and make the most out of Pennsylvania and make it live up to its potential and its history as the Keystone State.
Are you ready to work with the primary winner, no matter who that might be?
I absolutely am. Look, my philosophy is I'm willing to work with anyone who's willing to work with me. And that's why I think it's a big mistake to go out right now and say, well, here's who I want my running mate to be. I mean, that's a huge mistake because I don't think a lot of people understand this, but this is like an arranged marriage. It's a very odd system we have in Pennsylvania where you elect a governor separately from a lieutenant governor in the spring, and then they're inextricably tied together in the fall. So you don't want to create some kind of awkward marriage, and especially in 2022, when we have to beat Josh Shapiro. Republicans cannot afford to lose a single minute to some awkwardness in an arranged marriage. We need to hit the ground running immediately after the results of the primary. And those two candidates at the top of the ticket need to be a firm and strong team.
What if the Republican gubernatorial primary winner is a moderate who you disagree with on a certain issue of public policy? What happens then?
Actually, that's a benefit to Pennsylvania and to Republicans in Pennsylvania. And you have to look at this is a two-person ticket. So you don't want two people who are exactly the same at the top of the ticket. You want two people who are going to appeal to different sorts of voters. So I think that at the top of the ticket, we probably are going to need someone who can go to the suburbs of Pennsylvania and talk to those people who maybe voted for Joe Biden in 2020 and bring them back to the Republican fold. And then on the other hand, you're going to need someone in the second spot on the ticket who can appeal to the Republican base, who has been there for Republicans all through what we've been through with COVID, with the election integrity, with the mask mandates, the vaccine mandates, critical race theory in our schools. We need a champion of conservative values in the second spot on that ticket to complement someone at the top of the ticket who is going to go into the suburbs and is going to make those voters feel comfortable about voting Republican once again.
Can you talk about what you've learned on previous campaigns, and have you campaigned statewide before?
I have campaigned statewide before. I've run a number of statewide campaigns. Not all of them were for myself as a candidate. The last time I ran statewide, I was on the ballot in 2010 in a nine-person field for lieutenant governor. That's when Jim Cawley became the nominee. But before that, I was, 16 years ago, I had a group that was called PA Clean Sweep. It started after the midnight pay raise in 2005. I went around the state and I recruited 113 candidates for legislative seats. 13 of them got elected to the House of Representatives. One of them was my predecessor. Another one of them is now currently the Speaker of the House. I've learned a lot on that campaign. Then the year after that, I attempted to get on the ballot as an independent for governor. That was the race between Lynn Swan and Ed Rendell. I crisscrossed the Commonwealth and tried to get 67,000 signatures to get on the ballot. I only managed to get a mere 38,000. It was a lot of work, but it was a great lesson. And I made myself an object lesson in how difficult it is to do third-party politics in Pennsylvania. That said, since then, we've changed that rule, and nobody ever has to get more than 5,000 signatures to qualify as a third party or independent candidate. And I think that's a good thing. So I've had a lot of experience in statewide races in Pennsylvania, and I know that Pennsylvania is not only what happens in my county of Lebanon County. Pennsylvania is a very diverse state. I believe you could divide Pennsylvania up into 7 distinct separate regions, all with their different traditions, their cultures, their values, their political flavors. And I think it really does take someone on a statewide ticket, someone who's been across the state before and understands those regional differences in Pennsylvania.
Are you planning on running for your state house seat at the same time you're running for lieutenant governor?
I will be running for my state house seat at the same time, and here's why. Because unlike all the other candidates in this race, I am not here seeking a political position or political relevance. I already have relevance in the State House. I've done a lot of great things for the people of Pennsylvania in the State House. And, after the primary is over, I always felt a little bit sorry for Jeff Bartos. Jeff Bartos was our last lieutenant governor candidate, and he was teamed up with Scott Wagner. And unfortunately, Jeff Bartos's fortunes were tied to whatever Scott Wagner did, because, he rose and fell with Scott Wagner. But Jeff Bartos, to his great honor, soldiered on. He was a good soldier, and that's what I'll be. I'll be a good soldier. But ultimately, my fortunes as lieutenant governor will be tied to whatever the governor does. This is a support role. This is not a leading role. This is a support role. So if something should happen, I would like to be able to continue to serve in the State House. So I'm not willing at this point in time to say, I'm not going to run for State House.
With the remainder of our time, can you tell us how you separate yourself from the other candidates in this race and why you should be elected lieutenant governor?
Well, I think I've already talked a lot about it. I mean, my stance and my fight for the people of Pennsylvania, especially over the last 2 years, through the COVID pandemic, through the lockdowns, through the mandates, through the election integrity fight, everybody knows me for being in front of that. And that's how I'm going to help our next governor beat Josh Shapiro. I also believe I stand out from many of the candidates in the race with my experience, not just in Harrisburg, but my life experience, my varied life experience. I think I bring that to the table. And again, I think it's very important to remember the reason why we have a lieutenant governor is in case something tragic happens to our governor, God forbid, you need someone with a steady hand and with the experience and knowledge of being in Harrisburg for a little while to understand how the place works, in order to step into that role, if called upon, and do it in make for a very smooth and seamless transition.
And we've been talking with Russ Diamond, a Republican candidate for lieutenant governor. Thanks for talking with us.
Thank you.